I'm Andy Agavangelo. I'm the founder of campaign group Transparency Task Force. We are UK based, but we have members in 20 countries around the world, mostly UK, Australia, Canada, the USA, but other countries too. We have a formal purpose. In fact, we must have a formal purpose because we are an officially recognized certified social enterprise. Our formal purpose is, this is verbatim, to promote reform of the financial sector so that it serves society better. So the Transparency Task Force is all about the idea that the financial industry is profoundly important to the well-being of society, to economic stability, to political stability as well. And we think the sector is phenomenally important. However, we also believe that it has, unfortunately, a very high propensity to misbehave when given the chance to do so. And it does, often, sometimes very badly. Perhaps the greatest manifestation of the financial sector misbehaving is the global financial crisis, which not only caused economic and political mayhem right around the world and austerity measures for 10 plus years, it also caused, according to Oxford University research, it also caused the loss of life of about 10,000 people who took their lives as a direct consequence of, for example, losing their jobs, losing their homes, their families breaking down, and so on. So it goes without saying, folks, that the financial industry has got a great deal to account for. Tonight's session is about a topic area that is becoming of increasing importance to us as a campaign group. When I started Transparency Task Force way back in May 2015, so just over 10 years ago, we were focused on things like costs and charges in pensions and investments not being properly declared or shown. We were talking about things like that. As time has gone on, we have become increasingly focused, because we've had to, increasingly focused on things like regulatory failure, conflicts of interest, the revolving door problem, collusion, cover-up, and corruption. And I'm genuinely saddened to tell you that we are having to spend more and more of our time on those very, very dark and very, very serious issues. So our focus has gone from the conduct of the market participants, in other words, the banks, insurance companies, asset managers, and so on, to the regulatory framework that governs it. And of course, the regulatory framework that governs it is a function of political intervention, economic intervention, so on and so forth. And when you start to buy into the idea that there actually is corruption in our countries, you start to realize just how big the challenge is. But as Frank is going to explain, despite all this, there really is reason for hope. I'm going to share my screen and just walk you into a couple of things to draw your attention to. First of all, let's take a look at what people say about Frank. I'm going to read out, I'm going to put it on my screen as well. I'm going to read out what others think of Frank, because I think it's just a good way of introducing Frank. So this is what Martin Wolf says. Martin Wolf is a very, very well-known and very highly respected economics editor at the FT. He says, Frank Vogel has been a campaigner against the evils of corruption for decades. In this punchy and sobering book, The Enablers, he explains not just how pervasive it now is, but that Western governments, businesses, and professionals enable the kleptocratic regimes behind much of it. This is not just a bad thing in itself. It is a threat to the legitimacy and perhaps the survival of our democracies. The klepto cash flooding into our economies is a poison that weakens us and strengthens our enemies. About the book itself, about the enablers, it's all about the idea that authoritarian regimes in many countries and the men that lead them depend on the international management of licit and illicit funds under their control. Frank shows that curbing their activities for their kleptocratic clients is critical to secure democracy, enhance national security, and ensure international financial stability. In relation to the other book Frank will be talking about, Waging War on Corruption, it says, never before has the call for good governance been greater. The Arab Spring in early 2011 has inspired people all over the world to fight to the end the abuse of power by politicians and civic officials and create more transparent, accountable, and honest governments. In Waging War on Corruption, Inside the Movement Fighting the Abuse of Power, Frank Vogel, one of the leaders of the worldwide anti-corruption movement, shares a history filled with stories of heroes and victims of corruption. He chronicles the successful campaigns by enormously courageous civil society activists, journalists, and public prosecutors, and explains the crucial challenges that must now be confronted. At stake, and please do listen to this bit, folks, at stake is nothing less than our global security, the reduction of poverty, the stability of our economic and financial systems, and the cause of freedom and democracy. Waging War on Corruption will be of interest to leaders of politics, government, business, human rights, and law, and of course, us who are here tonight as activists and campaigners who are hoping for a world where the kind of positive, progressive, and purposeful reform that is so desperately needed can actually take place. In a moment, we're going to pass over to Frank to share his thoughts. Of course, Frank could talk for hours and hours about this, so we're really going to be getting the essence of Frank's mindset, not just in relation to things that have happened in the past, but also very, very contemporary issues, bringing things right up to date. But before we pass over to Frank, let's do what we obviously want to do, which is to show our appreciation for his time and participation today. Mr. Frank Vogel, thank you very, very much indeed, sir. Over to you. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Andy. I hope you all can hear me. Is that?
We can.
Okay? Okay, great. I remember being on a panel some years ago with a Russian journalist, and I mentioned some incident, and he immediately burst in and he said, you don't understand. We in Russia have a 1,000-year grand history of corruption. Well, I'm not going to go through the 1,000-year grand history today. I've only been involved as a fighter and campaigner for about 35 years. And I used to be really optimistic. I thought we were winning a lot of battles, and indeed we did. But right now, I think we are seriously at risk of losing the war. And that's what I really hope we can discuss today. What are the challenges? How do we get out of them? What are we going to do about a situation where almost every day, thanks primarily to the Trump administration, the fight against corruption is going seriously in reverse? Let me just say at the outset, the anti-corruption movement as a whole, whilst it does a tremendous amount of good, has become somewhat stuck in doing too much in the way of research and too little in the way of campaigning. And its targets, to a large extent, are fora that no longer have great influence. The G7, the G20, the United Nations, the OECD. So we need to think anew about refreshing the movement to communicate better, to fight better, to find better targets, to influence not only the general public, but also policy leaders at the top of Western governments. That's the challenge. I got involved in learning about corruption as a journalist back in 1974 when I was a Times correspondent in Washington, D.C. You remember that year, the year of Watergate, the year Richard Nixon resigned. And thereafter, there started investigations in the US into campaign finance at home and the corruption that was associated with campaign finance. but also corruption internationally. The bribery by multinational companies of Prince Bernhard, of the Prime Minister of Japan, of the Communist Party of Italy, believe it or not, and many others. And the result of that was the signing into law by President Carter of the Foreign Corrupt Practices Act. I followed all of those hearings and investigations, and I think that marks the beginning of a new era at the time of international efforts to really challenge corruption, particularly the bribery of foreign government officials by companies. Let's fast forward. The next phase really starts for me with the collapse of the Soviet Union, the fall of the Berlin Wall. Because until then, a lot of foreign aid was used simply to win supporters for the Cold War against the Soviet Union. The West was giving, for example, a large amount of aid to President Mobutu of the Congo, who was perhaps the largest kleptocrat at the time in the world. Once the Berlin Wall fell, a lot of governments, parliamentarians were starting to ask, well, what's the point of foreign aid? And if it's to reduce poverty in the developing countries, how can we make sure that the aid is not misused? How can we make sure the aid is not stolen? My friend from the World Bank, because I'd spent a decade at the World Bank, my friend from the World Bank, Peter Eigen, who was the World Bank's director in East Africa, was deeply concerned about corruption in foreign aid. And he and I and a group of friends who actually knew a lot more about corruption than either Peter or I did, decided to launch Transparency International. Peter was chairman, I was the first vice chairman. And so we started. And in the 90s, I think we had a lot of success. And the book, Waging War on Corruption, was stimulated by a belief that the public needs to understand the successes of the origins of TI, but more importantly, why the people in the TI movement across the world were doing what they were doing and dedicating themselves to the challenge of fighting corruption. We were very instrumental in convincing the World Bank and then other aid agencies to take corruption seriously. We played a big role in mobilizing European support for what became the OECD Anti-Bribery Convention, based on the same sort of yardsticks as the Foreign Corrupt Practices Act in the US. And we pressed very hard for the United Nations to start taking corruption seriously. But the most important work we did was fundamentally to encourage national chapters to be formed. Today, TI is in 113 different countries. Many of those national chapters are in authoritarian-run countries. And so to lead those chapters, to participate in them, involves an enormous amount of courage. People are in terrible risk constantly of being arrested or even murdered. This morning, I got a email from a friend in Tbilisi in Georgia, who says that right now all anti-corruption activists are being hounded by the authorities, and she fears, as do many of her colleagues, that they may be arrested at any minute. But she keeps on soldiering on, she keeps on protesting, and we see this in so many countries. And so the story of my book, in many ways, is the story of these heroes. Why do they do it? What are they achieving? And they're remarkable people. I have, talking to a British audience here, a largely British audience, I have great respect for the work that William Browder has done in the cause of Magnitsky, Sergei Magnitsky, who worked for him. In the book, however, I mentioned another person who barely ever gets mentioned. It is Sergei Magnitsky's mother, Natalia Magnitskaya, who I met in Moscow, who was holding press conference, who was campaigning for the truth about her son. She took enormous personal risk. After all, her son was murdered in jail. She took enormous personal risk to press then President Medvedev to release information about who killed her son and how. I remember that same visit, I went to the office of Elena Panfilova, Elena had founded TI Russia in 1990. And I remember Elena telling me that she had a couple of days earlier, a few days earlier, had typed on her computer a bitter letter of complaint about corruption in the government that she was going to send to the Minister of Interior. But then she didn't press send. She thought this was a pointless endeavor. And 2 days later, she got a phone call from the Ministry of Interior where the caller said, "We hear that you have written a letter of complaint." She hadn't even sent it, but she gave me that as an example of how she was constantly being monitored, constantly watched, constantly followed. And yet Elena continued to soldier on, continued to protest. There are many people like that who I wanted to write about in this book and want to tell their stories about the incredible achievements. Um, I remember a meeting of Transparency International where I was sitting around the table with friends from South Africa, Morocco, Russia, Nepal, and I suddenly realized I was the only one at the table who hadn't been in prison. All of them had been jailed at one time or another for fighting for human rights, for fighting against corruption, for fighting for democracy. And so I wanted to make this really a very important message in this book that we need to do much, much more to support civil society in the fight against corruption. There are people who are deeply patriotic, who believe that the welfare of their fellow citizens, so many of whom are constantly victims of corruption, that their welfare is paramount if their country is to be a decent country that where there is freedom of expression and where there is democratic rights and human rights. And that's what they're fighting for. And I close the book by mentioning three incredible women, Ellen Johnson Sirleaf, Lema Bawi, both from Liberia, and Tawakkol Kaman from Yemen. These three women won the Nobel Peace Prize in 2011. And as I quote in the book, at that prize-winning ceremony, Thorbjørn Jagland, who was the chair of the prize committee, quoted James Baldwin, who wrote, "The people who walk in darkness are no longer prepared to do so." Jagland added, "Make a note of that, all of those who wish to be on the right side of history." I should just say, mentioning those three women, that I have an omission in the book. If I write another book, maybe this will be the topic. The omission is the issue of sexual corruption. We constantly overlook what is possibly the greatest of all challenges to do something about in the corruption sphere. It's enormously difficult to curb and reduce sexual corruption. It is a vast problem involving hundreds of millions of women and children across the globe. And it's a subject we can certainly get into in discussion, but it does not dare be neglected. It should be front and center of many of the anti-corruption human rights discussions today. When I wrote a foreword and afterword to my book for the paperback edition in 2016, I reflected on where we stood at that time. This was shortly after the summit that Prime Minister Cameron had held on money laundering in London. And it became very clear to me that the critical thing that is missing in the anti-corruption fight is enforcement. That governments are not enforcing the regulations and the laws against corruption and money laundering, and that all of the platitudes, all of the nice rhetoric that we hear from everybody, it's just nice. It reminded me a bit of how The Economist portrayed Transparency International when we got launched. There was a cartoon of Don Quixote and Sancho Panza tilting at windmills. And when we used to tell people that we were created an organization to fight corruption, they would say, "Oh, that's very nice." But, there was great skepticism. And part of that skepticism result is due to the fact that governments pay lip service to anti-corruption, but they're not enforcing. And the more I thought about that and the more I discussed it with friends and colleagues, the more I realized that we in the Transparency International movement had focused too much on corruption in the South, in developing countries and emerging market countries, and not sufficiently in the North in the Western democracies. Corruption, after all, is universal. And this brought me to write the book, The Enablers. I should tell you that the word enablers was not that common when I actually wrote the book. It's now in common parlance. That's a good thing. But most of the recommendations in the book have, I'm afraid, been so far ignored. And I'd like to focus a bit on some of that. The Enablers was written not just because corruption is universal and people need to understand that trillions of pounds of dirty cash are parked in the world's Western financial centers. And for the most part, governments of Western countries have turned a blind eye, failing to adequately enforce anti-money laundering and anti-corruption laws and regulations. Sorry. The inadequacy of enforcement and the willingness of Western governments to ignore corruption and human rights as they enter strategic relationships with kleptocratic governments across the globe encourages corruption. My book sought to sound the alarm, and let me highlight the subtitle of the book, which is How the West Supports Kleptocrats and Corruption, Endangering Our Democracy. I shine a spotlight on the biggest banks that have been at the forefront of money laundering and who, when caught, receive fines that they view as just the cost of doing business. Can you imagine? The British Financial Conduct Authority recently fined Barclays Bank for money laundering a total of £42 million. That's not even small change for a bank like that. These kinds of token fines are meaningless. The banks ignore them, they're the cost of doing business, and the banks continue to do despicable things. The Swiss authorities have just recently forced HSBC in Geneva to close the accounts on several hundred of their Middle East clients because of money laundering. But there's been no fine imposed either by the British or the Swiss on HSBC for that, and HSBC has been caught many times before. I shine a light on the art auction business. Picassos and Monets are being bought and sold by people in organized crime or by kleptocrats, and the auction houses are not doing the due diligence that they really desperately need to do. They need to know their customers just like the banks. I shine a light on the real estate business, of course, Londongrad, as some people have called it. I want you to understand that all of these people, the real estate agents, the bankers, the financial advisors, the lawyers, the financial accountants, these are the enablers. These are the people who are helping kleptocrats across the world to launder their cash into Western capital markets, to do so secretly and to do so safely. And they are getting away with it on a massive scale, perhaps larger today than ever before. But now let's look at the democratic side of this, or the anti-democratic side of this. Very recently, President Trump hosted the president of Azerbaijan to lunch at the White House. And who, after all, cares that the Azerbaijani regime jails journalists, jails pro-democracy activists, launders vast amounts of stolen cash in the UK and elsewhere? You won't find any mention of all of that in the press reporting on President Aliyev's visit to the White House. Well, let's go closer to your home in the United Kingdom. Why do the British applaud so loudly the investments and sponsorship by the Emirates of Premier League soccer, of Wimbledon tennis, and the like, while ignoring the fact that massive gold shipments are going into the Emirates from Sudan in return for arms that are being shipped from the Emirates and elsewhere that are supporting the civil war in Sudan, which is the worst humanitarian crisis on the planet today. Why is there no outrage over how the Emirates are using cash to buy love through sport when at the same time they are behind this terrible genocide in Sudan? We find time and again that it is very convenient for Western governments to do deals with kleptocratic authoritarian regimes. Recently, President Trump hosted Field Marshal Azim Munir to lunch at the White House. He basically runs Pakistan. Pakistan, which is a home for a great deal of human trafficking, a huge amount of corruption, anti-democracy in every way. One of the things they talked about over that lunch, according to the Field Marshal spokesman, was cryptocurrency. Yeah, Pakistan's military leader was talking to the US president about cryptocurrency. Why? Because recently the government of Pakistan signed a deal, details of which have not been disclosed, with World Financial Liberty. That's the company run by Donald Trump's sons, and which Donald Trump has a direct financial stake. And if you go to their website, you'll see in the About section of the website, you will not only find Chairman Emeritus Donald Trump smiling at you, but you will also find the picture of his partner in this deal, Special Envoy Stephen Witkoff. The two of them are making a fortune by going around to governments, extorting them to invest one way or the other in World Financial Liberty or other deals like that. And at the same time, this is governing our foreign policy. And there's not nearly enough attention to those kind of things. Or on Qatar, which recently gave Donald Trump a present, a huge jumbo jet for his personal use when he leaves office. We could go on and on. Why is it that the UK was so often encouraging Russian companies to enlist on the London Stock Exchange, even though there was no transparency into the true books of these companies? Why is it that Gazprom could raise huge amounts of money in the UK bond markets, even though it was completely controlled by the Kremlin? Why is it that we turn a blind eye time and again in Western governments to who we are forging strategic relationships with, not recognizing that these are corrupt regimes where, if we are not introducing a modicum of integrity into our diplomacy, we are likely to only encourage more corruption, more anti-democratic efforts, which of course will rebound against us and our own societies. Let me close with two comments. In the book, I mention Paul Volcker, the legendary former Federal Reserve Board chairman, who wrote at the end of his memoir, and I quote, "Unavoidably, I end this memoir with a sense of deep concern. The rising tide of progress towards open democratic societies, the world in which I have lived and served, seems to be ebbing away." A few weeks ago, I went to Atlanta and visited the home of Martin Luther King. I visited the cemetery where many of his followers and leaders were buried, including the great John Lewis. And as I quote in my book, I quote Lewis as saying, "I have witnessed betrayal, corruption, bombing, lunacy, conspiracy, and even assassination, and I have still kept marching on." I think we all must keep marching on. We have an enormous amount of corruption to deal with. We have an Everest of corruption to climb, and we haven't really reached base camp. We must counter today's dire trends, but it demands that all of you listening here, participating here, double your own efforts to support civil society activists who, as the the chairman of the Nobel Prize Committee said, are on the right side of history. Thank you very much, Andy.
Frank, thank you. Thank you very, very much indeed. But before we go into the next part of our event, I'm sure others are going to want to join me in thanking you for what you just shared with us again, Frank. That was absolutely superb. I wish we could have days with you. In all honesty, I wish we could have days with you. It's so insightful and gives us a really good clue about where we ought to put our energies. In terms of how we're going to use the next 50, 60 minutes or so, what I'm proposing to do is just to share a few further thoughts of my own that relate to what Frank has been speaking about. We're also going to invite a few participants in particular to chip into the conversation. I'm thinking here about Sophia Sakihira, who's an anti-corruption expert based in the Ukraine. Sophia, great that you're with us. Also, Florin Badita, who's a founder of Corruption Kills in Romania. Rachel Sweet in the USA, I think, who's affixed to various organisations dealing with these issues, and also Seamus May in Ireland, who's a very active participant in the World of Transparency Task Force. Frank, you always impress me on so many levels, but can I just ask you, what is it that gives you reason to remain optimistic despite your clear understanding of just how challenging this landscape is? Why are you remaining optimistic, Frank?
Good question. And I could certainly depress everybody here when we talk about the Trump administration, about current trends. I'm lucky. I meet a lot of young people who are very determined to make this a better world. They give me the hope, they give me the inspiration. When, as I mentioned earlier, I got this email from a friend in Georgia. It's incredible what she's doing, even though she could be arrested at any moment. I'm absolutely impressed by the tremendous determination of friends in Ukraine, for example, who, despite the war, despite the oppression, despite the history of corruption in their country, are working tirelessly to deal with corruption issues in a very positive, constructive way. I'm involved and the founder of the Partnership for Transparency Fund. We've just finished actually a tremendous project in Moldova, another country constantly under Russian threat, where corruption has been an enormous problem. We've been involved with civil society there in doing training programs to bring transparency to public procurement. Public procurement is the largest single area of corruption in most countries. These people are courageous, they are determined, they're young, enthusiastic. They give me a great deal of hope. And I could mention many other countries where we find similar situations. A younger generation is not willing to accept the status quo, even though old folks, including me, have for too long basically failed to give democracy and anti-corruption the support that it deserves and demands.
Thank you very much indeed. Thank you. I'm going to cover a few points before we kind of share the conversation with others in the group tonight. Something that's becoming of increasing interest to me is the nexus between bad acting by bad actors and where a government seems to either be in some way complicit or at very least seems to be turning a blind eye, turning a Nelsonian eye to what is going on. And you may have seen in the chat earlier, folks, I've made reference to the Sandstorm report. The Sandstorm report, Sandstorm was the code name given, I think, by the Bank of England in relation to the BCCI, the Bank of Commerce, which became a massive corrupt organization from head to toe. I'm going to share my screen and show you something, and I'm going to tie this point into what I've been saying about where governments are either turning a blind eye or are even in some way complicit. So at the top of this document, we've got some rather interesting words: bank secret. This is a document that we were never supposed to see. The reason we are able to see it is because of the work of Prem Sikka, now Lord Sikka. And through the efforts of Lord Sikka, he was able to drag to the surface this sandstorm report in an unredacted form. Where you see bits encapsulated in red, these are the bits of the report that are actually supposed to be redacted, the bits we were never ever supposed to see. I'm not going to go through it in detail here, but what it talks about in very, very broad terms is the extreme corruption in a banking organization that involved all kinds of nefarious activities, the very worst things that humanity gets involved with. I mean, just look at it. You've got bits here about, for example, the statement of fictitious profits and losses. There's all kinds of horrible stuff going on here. And I make this point because despite how challenging it can sometimes be, when you have people like Frank, when you have people like Lord Prem Sikka, who relentlessly pursue the truth, have that mindset of sunlight is the best disinfectant, there is always going to be room for hope. Lord Prem Sikka is a founder of this organisation on the screen, the Association for Accountancy and Business Affairs. I'll pop a link to that website in a moment as well. Have a look if you'd like to. He's one of many people that we are very, very pleased to think of as an ally in this space. And tonight's event's been made possible by that organisation and from that support. One other quick thing I'll share with you is data, hard data. Surely hard data's got an important part to play in exposing true corruption and true bad activity. Let me show you what I mean. So this is a page from Violation Tracker Global. We know Violation Tracker very well. The guys there are based in Washington, DC, but there's now a US version of the database, a UK version, and this version, which is the international version. And if you search the database, it's very easy to search. And if you look for information about anti-money laundering, you get this page we're looking at now. And it's a page where we rank the organization by how much the fine was. So the first one there, the top of the list, Binance Holdings Limited in 2023 were prosecuted in the US jurisdiction. If you click on the monetary amount, it will give you the detail about what they were getting up to. Please do take a look at that when I put the link in the chat. But the fine was, is this right? $4,316,126,163. That's the fine. How bad has your conduct got to be for you to get a fine that much? No doubt there was activity pertaining to corruption in all of that. And if you do scroll down the list, you start to see a pattern, which is the same organizations doing the same kind of things over and over again. Recidivism. And that must surely point to a point that Frank made so well earlier, which is that these organizations, these enablers, seem to see doing the wrong thing, making a fortune out of it, paying a fine as simply the cost of doing business. I'll chip in with further thoughts later, but can we please now go to the first one of our attendees who's going to be chipping into the conversation? Please do, Frank, go for it.
Yeah, Andy, sorry, just maybe 2 footnotes on just what you've said.
Please do.
First of all, BCCI. Yeah, the Bank of England knew about it. Various other central banks knew about it. But it wasn't until Robert Morgenthau, the New York attorney general, who actually had the guts to go and prosecute. His investigations, his prosecution blew up BCCI, basically forced it to close. And what we lack today are prosecutors with the guts
like that
Morgenthau had, because he had to take on the top of the establishment, including some very prominent Americans who were involved with BCCI. That's that point. Second point on Binance, you mentioned it. So let me just mention to all of you who are not aware of this. Binance paid $4.5 million fine. The chairman of Binance, Mr. Zhao, went to prison for 4 months. What is he doing now? He is a partner with Donald and Eric Trump and
Right.
Zach Witkoff in World Financial Liberty. He was instrumental in getting the Emirates to invest $2 billion into World Financial Liberty. And he is campaigning very hard right now to get a pardon from President Trump. If he puts in a little bit more money, that pardon will be forthcoming. Sorry to interrupt the session, but
not at all. That's fantastic context, and it's increasingly difficult to remain optimistic, and we really do have a fight on our hands, folks. This is not some kind of abstract idea we're talking about. The idea that there's corruption in the system. We, the people, have to fight for the standards and the integrity that we must and should actively demand. And at the end of the day, folks, we do, at least in theory, live in parliamentary democracies. Let's bloody well use our votes. Excuse my language. Let's use our votes. I can't wait to hear from Sophia. So, Sophia, please take a moment to introduce yourself, and just in a couple of minutes, we haven't got too much time, but in a couple of minutes, Sophia, share with us whatever key points that you'd like to. And of course, feel free, Sophia, to put any links into the chat to any work that you want to share with the group. Thank you, Sophia, for being here. Thank you.
Good evening. Here, I don't know where you all are located, so good afternoon, good evening for everyone. Thank you for this opportunity to join this conversation. Thank you, Mr. Vogel, for presentation of your 2 incredible books. And actually, I have made a couple of notes just to reflect on everything that I have already heard. And of course, from the perspective of Ukraine experience in anti-corruption. So first, I want to tell that it is absolutely true that international aid, I mean technical aid, to tackle corruption is a really key factor that can influence the field, I mean the landscape and all the everything in the country. Why I'm telling this? That just from the experience of Ukraine, and when we look into the 10-year span of time, when after the Revolution of Dignity, and when Ukraine declared, even in our constitution, that we are moving towards the European Union integration, because the civil society desired and demanded this. And all the international anti-corruption, international aid that was offered to Ukraine from the International Monetary Fund, from the European Union, from other financial international institutions and other international organizations, played a crucial role, because the country's circumstances in terms of finance, in terms of economy, were really hard, and country needed money just for development, for reforms, even for living. And our government, our president, former president, they were forced to push all those reforms that we are now benefit results of these reforms. And this aid played a crucial role. I will repeat this main point. It's key point here. But there must be particular national context. When the country, the whole society, is not ready to fight for their democracy, in this case, international aid is under risk to be stolen, misused, etc. But when there is a really strong civil society control, and influence and great will, society will, to tackle corruption. In this case, this factor turns to be the key one, international aid factor. And this is a window of opportunity. That is exactly what international organizations, donors must take into account. I want to say that measure of civil society leverage, try to measure. And if it is really strong civil society, then all those efforts that international community is doing to push anti-corruption efforts in a particular country, they are likely to succeed. Another point, and that would be the final point that I want to make, we are here talking about waging, right, war on corruption. Well, actually, we are all human beings, and it is civil society law that the more a person has, the more the person wants. And what I'm trying to say that corruption, unfortunately, existed, it is still existing, and it will exist in this world. It will never. So this war will never be ended. Never. So we must be ready for this, understand this, realize it, recognize this fact, and just that is why I'm sharing this optimism that Mr. Vogel is also expressing that. But if we look into a couple of centuries ago, yeah, the situation was dramatically worse. So, but this war will never end. And what can enable anti-corruption global community, or in particular countries, enable anti-corruption activists succeed? That is, and I like this point, youngest generation, education, awareness raising. So young people are those who we all must invest as much as possible. Not only money, but our efforts in education, behavior, and form their values. That is another factor that can help globally and locally build up this society that who will not tolerate, who will report, who will go to the government and rule the country, rule their local authorities, and make changes, real changes.
Fantastic, Sophia. Fantastic. Sophia, your contributions wonderful. Are you in Ukraine right now?
Right. I'm based in Kiev.
Wow. Wow. You're the first person we've had from your wonderful country speak at one of our events, Sophia. Thank you for being with us tonight. Our thoughts are with you in so many ways, and I really haven't got words to correspond to the challenges your country has right now. But I do know that there's been a beginning, that we're partway through it, and there will eventually be an end to it. And let's all hope and pray and work to make sure that the end that happens for your country is the righteous end that it deserves. Honestly, it's so important. Sophia, thank you very much for being here. I'm going to go to Frank to respond, if you'd like to, and comment on any of the points that you've just made, Sophia. After Frank has done that, we're going to hear from Florin, then Rachel, then Seamus. Just to give Frank a moment or two to perhaps collect his thoughts on what he wants to say about Ukraine and about what Sophia has said. I'm going to once again share my screen just to draw your attention to a particular matter that is completely driving me nuts. Let me explain what I mean. Let me explain what I mean. I think I'm right in saying that the UK has the oldest parliament. Forgive me if I've got that wrong, but for some reason that phrase is stuck in my head. I say that because of what I'm showing you. This is a debate that took place in the UK Parliament yesterday. As you may be able to see from the small writing on the right-hand side, it's a debate about a duty of candour. And this is a debate that's all about the idea, wait for it, all about the idea that, I feel so stupid even saying it. It's about the idea that public bodies have got to tell the truth. Isn't that mad? Isn't it mad that we have politicians now in September 2025 talking about the idea of introducing a law to make politicians tell the truth? Because up until now, it would appear they haven't had to. And this has manifested in all kinds of horrific situations in our country. One of them being something called the Hillsborough disaster, where many football fans lost their lives. Not only was that tragedy, but there was then a massive systemic cover-up of what went on. All kinds of horrible things in relation to what we call the contaminated blood scandal, a horrific fire called Grenfell, and related matters. And you know what, folks? If you watch this debate, please do. You'll hear politician after politician after politician talk about why we must have a duty on public servants to tell the truth. And then at the end of that, you get all kinds of reasons why the government in my opinion, doesn't seem to be keen to bring the law in without some kind of dilutions. I'll put a link to that in the chat. Please do watch it. Even if you're not in the UK, you might find it quite fascinating to hear the rationale behind having to argue that public servants must tell the truth. Frank Vogel, anything you'd like to say in relation to what Sophia spoke about? Thank you.
Well, it's wonderful to hear Sophia and to see her, and I completely agree with what she said. It's really interesting, Marie Yovanovitch was the American ambassador in Ukraine. Sophia probably knows her. She was fired by Donald Trump when he was president last time round. She was fired for basically supporting anti-corruption efforts and stopping Trump's effort to blackmail President Zelensky at the time. And she, in writing her memoir, and it's called Lessons from the Edge, it's a very inspiring book. She talks about the need for diplomats to never forget when they're working in authoritarian countries that supporting anti-corruption movements to supporting anti-corruption is one of their vital tasks. So yes, foreign aid is incredibly important in supporting civil society. The trouble is, a more general point, foreign aid is being cut. The Trump administration has literally closed USAID. The British government, the German government, and others are transferring funds that once were used for aid into increasing defense spending. The total flow globally of foreign aid this year is down about 15%, according to the OECD, and that's following a 9% fall last year. And what does that mean for civil society? It means that many civil society organizations around the world are now in serious financial difficulty. There are many independent journalists who are finding it incredibly difficult to get the foreign support they need to do their courageous work. One of the marvelous people who is, by the way, on this event today is Greg Hittleman, who is the communications director for The Century. The Century, which was founded in part by George Clooney, does incredible investigative work into corruption in Africa. And please go to the Century's website to see what they do. But it's getting harder and harder to do this kind of work and to find local journalists, to find local civil society organizations in countries at a time when there is such a tremendous cut in foreign aid resources. So, Sophia, everything you said, I totally agree with, and I'm as hopeful as you are. Thank you.
Thank you, Sophia. Thank you. Where are we going next? I think we are next going to Florin. Florin, please take a moment to briefly introduce yourself. Tell us a bit about what you do and what you think about what's been discussed tonight. What matters to you, Florin? What matters to you?
Andy, thank you. So short, I'm Florin Bădiță, activist. I founded in 2015, there was a night fire tragedy that killed 65 people because of corruption, and we started Corruption Kills. One of my friends also died there, and the aim was we're working both into places. One of them is data using FOIA, like how can we obtain data all around the world, but focusing on Romania. But for that, I developed a methodology called Act FOIA. I put the link earlier, where basically like how can we use the FOIA, because it's childish of us to expect politicians, especially if they have an interest, if we have a kind of a captured state, we shouldn't expect them to be so open, like, yeah, we data.gov and we put everything there. No, they will try to hide as much as possible. That's their end game. As less transparency, so we can do our things without being questioned by pesky journalists and other people. So that methodology for us, it was like, okay, we have the Freedom of Information Request Act. How can you use it in our advantage? This applies to 105 countries or something like this. So at least for half of the world, we can use this tool. And we started using it, and we developed this Act FOIA methodology that allows you to do it at scale. Like you can ask 200 local authorities and you get the cost for something for each of them, and then you can compare the cost and you can kind of see where is something more expensive. So you basically create your own data sets. And then you can automatize, especially now with AI, you can also automatize some of the parts, so you can have a more direct way, like, okay, the government, I don't know, under Trump now, they are not publishing some type of data, but the data still exists at the smaller authorities. How can we get this kind of data? So yeah, this was one of our focus, and the others was, okay, we actually need to be on the streets and create public pressure and create protest. And we organized in 2017 the biggest protest in the history of our country, with more than 500,000 people on the street, when our government wanted to legalize corruption. They wanted to modify the law, so if you steal less than 35,000 euros and you are a public employee, you would not get to jail anymore. So this was what they wanted. And for the Western world, these kind of things are like, oh, this cannot happen. But as we see now in the US, democracy is really fragile, and especially the US is much better suited than other countries because of the power that the president has compared to other countries. So we've seen already in less than a year how much things have changed. And me personally, I declined to go to the States for different events this year just because of the political situation there. And it's not yet over. And yeah, to be more optimistic also, uh, which is harder for me personally at the moment to be kind of optimistic, maybe on the fact that there are different waves and you need to have the dictators, so you then have the anti-corps and the people that are raising up to do, because if not, people will just exist. I think like I haven't read the book, but putting the enablers as like it's kind of like the banality of evil, in the sense of yeah, let's put a spotlight on some of the other players that enable this kind of corruption and this abuse of power to happen, and see how we could yeah, by focusing on that, and yeah, people getting aware about this, then ideally some new laws, maybe they will come to create more pressure and not and sometimes higher yeah, fines, or even something more than fines.
Thank you.
Yeah, that's about it for me.
Florian, thank you very much. In a moment, we'll go to Frank to reflect on what Florian has said, but I'm going to make a statement and then I'm going to explain why I feel justified in making the statement I'm about to make. Florian, we are honoured to have you with us. We are honoured to have you with us. I didn't know anything about you until a little while ago, but let me show you what I found, ladies and gentlemen. Let me show you what I found. This is a Euronews piece, obviously in relation to Romania, which is Florian's country. European Personality of the Year, Florian Badita, founder of Corruption Kills. What's heartbreaking is what this article talks about. At just 30 years old, of course, at the time, Florian has founded a movement that has single-handedly exposed endemic corruption in Romanian political life. It talks about a fire in a nightclub to do with fireworks. I'll put a link to this in the chat. You can read it for yourselves in a minute. Why Corruption Kills. The movement was named, he explains to Euronews' Sophie Claudette, because of the fire deaths were caused by this fireworks being let off by collectives state-sanctioned non-compliance with health and safety regulations. The authorities knew about it and did nothing. You honour us with your presence, sir, and you've clearly dedicated your life to speaking up for your friend and others who were impacted as they were. Jeez, Frank, over to you.
Well, thank you. First of all, great to meet Florian. That's the young people I'm talking about. This is the future. These are the people who are going to make the difference. And this is why I'm fundamentally optimistic. Let me make 2 points. First of all, corruption does kill, and we don't talk enough about that. If you look at what happened in the earthquakes in China, in Turkey, in Mexico, you find that buildings collapsed, thousands of people were killed. Why did those buildings collapse? Because local officials were bribed by construction developers so that they could build those buildings on the cheap, so that they could avoid putting in the safeguards against earthquakes that were absolutely essential, and thousands died. So corruption kills, and we see it in so many different ways. Let me also make a point, a more technical point, because Florian mentioned data earlier. There is a tremendous organization based in the UK called the Open Contracting Partnership that does wonderful work with in many countries today in helping to make public procurement transparent. We're talking about public procurement amounting to something like more than $13 trillion a year. It's enormous. The more we can use new technology to add to transparency in competitive bidding, in the transparency of procurement, the more we can reduce corruption. I think artificial intelligence will be incredibly helpful here. And it's something that we need to think much more about. And I think more and more people in the anti-corruption space are in fact getting more deeply involved in technologies in order to use data better. Thank you.
Thanks, fantastic, Frank. Thank you very much. Wow, this is a very, very powerful conversation that we're having tonight. I feel that way. I hope you do too. Rachel Sweet, lovely to have you with us. Please do take a moment to tell us a bit about yourself, what you do, and what matters to you. Thank you, Rachel.
Great, thank you so much, and I so appreciate the invitation to be here. My name is Dr. Rachel Sweet. I work at the intersection of illicit markets, elite corruption, and conflict environments. I've worked as an expert on various tribunals with the UN. I work with different international criminal courts, and as a professor, and I focus on collusion and corruption within conflict minerals as well as petrodollars. And I work with civil society organizations on the ground within Sub-Saharan Africa and the Middle East to do so. Our purpose is to provide higher quality evidence and understanding of the real world tactics and empirical practices of corruption, both within countries as well as how they connect to the international system. Frank, I have three questions for you, if you could entertain them. One, they are on the tactics, the tools, and also the strategies that we can use to tackle high-level corruption. First, the tactics. One of the key findings from my teams around the world is the systematic cross-infiltration between the bad actors, between conflict actors, between international traffickers, and the regulatory institutions that we imagine should contain them. I'm just popping in the chat one small example of this, which is from an article I published a few years ago. If you go to the end of the article, you'll see a large number of tax documents from the Democratic Republic of Congo. This is how armed groups infiltrated, repurposed the official taxation bureaus, the official migration bureaus, in order to launder their own conflict minerals, diamonds, gold, as if it were legal. So my teams find the systematic cross-infiltration, not only within Africa, but also looking at the petrodollars and how they're allocated to paramilitary financing in Iraq, for example. And we link these to the cross-infiltration at the global scale, looking at how, as you've said, corporations like HSBC, Chase, are not only participating within this, but also other regulatory institutions like the OECD or different mineral regulatory agencies are oftentimes have on their boards the same individuals and traffickers who are participating within these economies in the first place. So so the tactics of cross-infiltration, how do we stem this? One of our key findings is that the tools that we typically use in order to address these dynamics aren't sufficient. Oftentimes the tools, looking at things like bureaucratic documents, tax records, making sure that payments aren't made to armed actors, are fabricated and produced by the armed actors themselves. So how do we work across these challenges? My team works with prosecutors within various tribunals to train prosecutors on how these work and how to address these dynamics. And then finally, my question is on the strategy of how we would effectively engage and persuade bad actors. So Frank, you mentioned that we're no longer in the world of the G7, G20, UN, OECD being the institutions that should be our primary targets. How do we advocate successfully and effectively for transparency in an age where we need to effectively engage bad actors themselves? So how do we shift the strategy, shift the discourse to target individuals and elites who maybe don't care about good governance and don't care about transparency? How do we show that it's actually in their own financial and material interest in order to engage these questions as well? Thank you so much for having me.
Rachel, this is great input. Please do, Frank, respond to the comments, thoughts, ideas, opportunities that Rachel has just set out there to speak to. Thank you, Frank.
They're very good points. I don't think enough people publicly really understand that human trafficking, wildlife plunder, for example, is only possible because organized crime is bribing public officials. The scale of these crimes is absolutely enormous. We have greater volume number of people involved as victims of human trafficking today than ever before in history. And there's bribery at every point in the whole process of human trafficking. I think it's very important that organizations like the Sentry and Global Witness, which over the years have been at the absolute forefront of investigating the kinds of criminal activities that Rachel is talking about, notably in minerals, that those organizations get far greater public support and that the media takes these organizations much more seriously than it currently does. it is appalling that there was an article in the Financial Times, just to give you one example, the other day, where they talked about Donald Trump and his relationship with India. And in passing, they happened to mention that the Trump administration had agreed to give some quotes, take some quotes, sweeteners from Pakistan. They're talking bribes. When you start using euphemisms like sweeteners for outright bribes, you're in trouble. I don't think the mainstream media is taking corruption nearly as seriously today as it did even 10 years ago. I think it's come to accept too much of it, and I think it needs to be challenged. But I really would strongly suggest, in answer to the first point that Rachel made, organizations like Global Witness, please go to their website. Organizations like The Century, please go and look at what they're doing. Their reporting is fantastic. They have enormously brave people who are doing their investigations, and I think we need to shine a really big spotlight on that. Now, the second point, how do we change bad actors? Put them in jail. Sanctions are not being imposed in anything like the way that they should be. And let's start with some of the bad actors in the banks. Before we go to before we go to the kleptocrats, just imagine, Andy early in this discussion mentioned the global financial crisis of 2008, 2009, and all the suffering that that produced. And it was produced because of fraud. So finally, the US government, the Attorney General of the United States at the time under President Obama, hauls in Jamie Dimon, the chairman, chief executive officer of JP Morgan Chase, the world's largest bank, by the way, currently managing $4 trillion of assets. And he says to Jamie Dimon, your bank has to pay a fine for all of the terrible things that you've done. We fined Bank of America $17 billion, and now it's your turn. And Jamie Dimon starts negotiating. And in the end, JP Morgan Chase pays a fine of $13 billion. So what happens to Jamie Dimon? His board of directors gives him a bonus because he got a lower fine than Bank of America. They didn't throw him out. The bank paid a huge fine. The board actually gave the guy a bonus. This is what is happening time and time again. Goldman Sachs paid the largest single fine under the Foreign Corrupt Practices Act for being involved in the theft of $4.6 billion from the government of Malaysia. What happened to the chairman? He took a $10 million voluntary pay cut only to get a $30 million bonus 3 months later for the good performance of the bank. If we do not start by developing ways to seriously address the corporate leaders who are the enablers in all of this process, and I mean with actual prosecutions and not just with raps over the knuckles in terms of fines, then we won't address the issues that Rachel is talking about. We need to start with the corporate people because they're the easiest targets. But don't forget, the kleptocrats in many countries depend on these enablers. They depend on the bankers and the auction houses and the real estate people for laundering their dirty cash. And sadly, shareholders in these in many of these institutions are not holding their chief executives or even their board of directors to account. And the boards of many of these corporations, as Rachel pointed out, either involve questionable characters or people who are just friends of the chief executive officer and therefore will not hold him to account either. So I think that's a way to start. And in my book, I give an example of how we could hold the top corporate people to account. And the example is Enron. The Enron crisis, the WorldCom crisis, if some of you remember that, led to some of the top executives getting very long jail terms. We need to use the same mechanisms that were used to force prosecutions of those corporate leaders. We need the same mechanisms to apply to bribery and corruption.
Fantastic, fantastic. I hope everyone's getting as much out of this event as I am. I've just put a note in the chat to an item I'm going to share on my screen because we're about to hear from Seamus May. And Seamus is a member of our community in Ireland. Every Wednesday at 1 o'clock UK time, we have a session, we call it Ireland Matters. And what we're learning through those conversations is the banking shenanigans that happen in the UK are the same in Ireland, if not even worse. So I'm just going to share my screen to show you this. So I'll put a link to it in the chat. I highly recommend you watch this. It's Seamus May talking about Ireland, a democracy or a corpocracy. It's really, really well worth watching. I do highly recommend it. But let's go to Seamus. Seamus, please do share whatever you'd like to. Thank you.
Yes, thank you, Andy, for the introduction. I don't know if I should be sharing a platform with all these wonderful people here tonight. At the top of the list, of course, is Frank, but I've listened to everybody. It's been terrific. I have spent over 50 years fighting corruption, mainly in Ireland. And, you know, I am certainly not a glass half full merchant. I'm glass half empty because I can see in Ireland, which is, you know, we're part of Europe and we're part of much bigger markets, the levels of corruption are they're frightening. Every sinew of our country is corrupt. And when I say that, as countries move on and become much more sophisticated, I have found that you move from raw, naked corruption to brown envelope, you move to legal corruption. And legal corruption is very easy to enable in a small country. Up to the last few years, we were a country of 4.5 million people and 2 big political parties with a third one there now. And they literally have, they're untouchable. You know, we're talking about what sort of sanctions we take against them. Well, like we have a competition authority in Ireland. It came in and it had to come in 1991 because the EU forced us. And it has effectively done just practically zero in 34 years. The same with the Office of Corporate Enforcement. Again, another, you know, part of the government. It has done nothing in 26 years. These, and I have regularly spoken in public, and I call them phony regulators because that's what they are. So, like, and we have nobody, and we've talked there was a good bit of talk about various journalists and that, but like journalists in Ireland, as everywhere else, they have wives, they have children, they have husbands, they have car loans, they have mortgages. And you cannot get anything into mainstream Irish media except what suits the corporations, the World Economic Forum, the Bilderbergs, the Davos, all of these things dominate how our country, Ireland, is run. It's very funny because, Sophia, I've been very active in Ukraine off and on. And at the present time, there's a Supreme Court case starting in Ukraine on Monday with regard to the cement industry. But without going into any detail on that, I cannot believe, again, what's going on over there. It seems to be all theatre and the real work is done behind closed doors. I have, in our country, I have availed of the judiciary and have spent 20, almost 29 years in one particular competition case. And like, it's a free for all. There's no proper method of appointing judges. Judges are appointed effectively by political parties. Political parties are kept running by giant corporations, and the circle goes on and on and on. So there was a couple of other points. And this one is one, Frank, that I don't want you to take any offense with, but I want to make it because I have been a member of Transparency International Ireland since about 2007 or 2008. And it's a very small operation. I have the height of respect for virtually everyone I've come across over the years. They have produced a couple of terrific reports, one National Integrity Systems 2009 and a follow-up then in 2012. But other than that, Transparency International Ireland, it does not tackle corruption, as in the real corruption. It does a good job on some stuff that I would say is quite minor. And the problem that I see is that it is anything, the chapter is anything from 80 to 95% funded by government. And you cannot be independent when you're funded by a particular party with a vested interest, i.e. the government. And so much so that, like, I have, like most volunteers, I would have offered to go on the board of Transparency International Ireland in all of the, not all of those years, but at different times. And I'm the only one that has not managed to get on the board to help and promote anti-corruption practices. Yes, I'm the one that knows more about them in our country than probably nearly anybody else. So, like, I have given my life to fighting corruption, and whatever part of my life remains will be about fighting corruption. But that's just a practical little point. I've made a few there.
Thank you.
I've said enough now. I look forward to
Thank you.
responses.
Thank you. I shouldn't really reveal my biases, but I just love listening to your accent, Frank. Seamus, I absolutely do. I really, really do. I've listened to that all day. Seamus, thank you. Frank, what would you like to say in response to what's just been said? That was interesting, wasn't it?
Yeah, very much so. And I think I'm not going to talk about TI Ireland, but I hear the point. I'm not involved anymore in the direction of Transparency International, but I hear your point, and I will convey it to some of my friends. The more general point I'd like to make is when I think of Ireland, I think that one of the areas of corruption we haven't been talking about here today is tax avoidance by multinational corporations. And I especially use the word avoidance and not just tax evasion. Tax evasion is obviously illegal, but the legal loopholes that allow for tax avoidance are also ones that inevitably hurt consumers and have many victims. And Ireland has been in the spotlight there in some respects. Let me also just add one other thing that we haven't really mentioned yet today, but we're running out of time, so I'd like to mention it. The Trump administration's actions are legalizing money laundering. Maybe I should repeat that. The actions that are being taken to deregulate all aspects of cryptocurrencies, including the halting of all investigations into fraudulent companies, the suspension of prosecutions of people who were under investigation previously by the Securities and Exchange Commission, the determination of President Trump to make the United States, as he calls it, the crypto capital of the world. All of this is creating an environment where money laundering via cryptocurrencies is becoming legalized in the United States. I think it is something that we dare not overlook. It's going to be an increasing issue. It may be relatively small today, but I think it's going to expand enormously. One of the beneficiaries, of course, is President Trump himself and his family, and the Witkoffs, who I've mentioned, but also the Commerce Secretary Howard Lutnick, whose son runs Cantor Fitzgerald. Lutnick ran it in New York, which is, again, one of the issuers of a major cryptocurrency called Tether. We need to look at this very seriously and take it seriously because it is a serious threat to the financial system. I think people forget that the scale of money laundering today is such that it can add gravely to stability in the financial system as a whole. And of course, with all the dangers that that produces. Thank you, Andy.
Thank you very much indeed. In a moment, I'm going to be passing back to Frank to share with us his final comments. And within that, Frank, please do talk about the vital role of whistleblowers. I mentioned whistleblowers for a particular reason. Again, I'm going to share my screen, if I may, please, folks, just to draw your attention to a couple of things. Transparency Task Force is truly blessed by the caliber of the people involved in our work, including the folks involved in our advisory group. This is our advisory group. They basically keep me on the straight and narrow, help to keep me focused on our mission. It's a self-imposed piece of governance, and it does a great job. It really does. This gentleman here, Ian Foxley, he's a remarkable guy. I mention Ian because I've just spoken about whistleblowing. Ian has just become a member of TTF's advisory group, and I'm really proud of that. I'll tell you why I'm so proud of it. Spend some time listening to, watching this podcast, episode 1 of the Parrhesia tapes. The word Parrhesia, folks, basically, the word Parrhesia it comes from the ancient Greeks. It's all about the idea of speaking the truth regardless of the likely consequences. You know, Parrhesia is all about speaking the truth regardless of the likely consequences. And of course, it's a beautiful name for this particular organization, Parrhesia, which Ian Foxley founded, Dr. Ian Foxley, I should say, founded it, which is a whistleblowing charity. Please do listen and watch some of these podcasts. At the very, very least, listen and watch the one from Ian Foxley himself. It's about a story of him being involved with a major contract. He got suspicious there was corruption. He realized there was corruption. He reported it accordingly through his proper channels in the organization he was working for. And he then ended up in a situation where he literally had to flee for his life. That's who Dr. Ian Foxley is. So we mustn't underestimate the value, the importance, the guts of folks like Dr. Ian Foxley and many others who have that Parrhesia mindset, the willingness to speak out regardless of the potential risks themselves. I can see that Mark Bannister's put his hand up. Mark, I'm going to go to you just before we go to Frank for his final thoughts. And I guess we'll be wrapping up in about 5 minutes, folks. Mark Bannister, the succinct version, please. That would be great. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Andy. I just want to respond to Frank and set him straight on something. Not all cryptocurrencies are rated equal. And I would tell you that the blockchain and Tether and stable coins and its like is in fact something that you should all welcome. And there's a very good reason why I say that to you. I have a fair degree of knowledge about all of this because I'm a banker and all the rest of my background. If you take all fiat currencies, they are completely invented. They do not exist. Okay, there is no tracking of them. There is no accounting. There is nothing. The huge advantage that will come with the advocation of cryptocurrencies, and I'm afraid I take the total opposite view to you, is it is about the best thing that could ever happen against anti-corruption. If you're an anti-corruption person, you should be desperately running straight towards this because it creates a record of where that money went. So when the money, as soon as it exists, there is a ledger that is devolved, so it cannot be corrupted because it's held in multiple places all at once, and it follows and tracks it. Now, for various reasons, I actually happen to know an awful lot about Tether, and I won't go further than that, other than to say to you that they create when they are able, or when there are issues around misuse of it or bad actors using it, their ability to track them down is something that they can do in minutes, literally in minutes, and lock those currencies out. No fiat currency can do that. So I would tell you that you're gravely mistaken if you rank all of these things together. Now, the one exception to that is Bitcoin because of its original anonymity, right? But I think that you will find, and there I concede that there are issues, but the vast majority of Bitcoin is increasingly held within exchanges and therefore within ledgers within the exchange. In other words, effectively, you own it through a broker and he owns it and he can track it, etc., etc. So yes, there are terrible problems, and I totally agree with you that the Trump coin and all of that is just a mechanism for extorting money. It's utterly preposterous. But do not rank the same, all of them together in the same boat, because they are absolutely.
Well, forgive me, Mark. I accidentally unmuted you there, but I think you were coming to a close anyway. Forgive me, Mark. I think we clearly need a session on crypto, angel or devil. We'll have that session, Mark. We'll have a proper dive into it. Frank, please do give us your final thoughts. Of course, go back to the topic about crypto if you'd like to. Talk about the important role that whistleblowers play, and then I'll wrap the session up after you've had your final comments. Thank you, Mark Bannister. Over to Frank.
Well, thank you very much. Thank you all for having me. It's wonderful that you've all participated today. I'm especially grateful to my great friend Roger Offenbach, who's been patiently listening and listening to me for the last 75 years as well. So that's terrific that he's there. Thank you all. Yes, I started my talk by talking about a Russian who talked about 1,000 years of grand corruption in Russia. We're not going to end corruption soon. I have no illusions. I do strongly support whatever protections could be made for whistleblowers and incentives for whistleblowers to come forward. The US system does provide substantial incentives. Almost all of the transnational major corporate bribery investigations that were successful were based initially on reports by whistleblowers. Much more generally, I do believe that we are at grave risk in the anti-corruption world, largely because of the policies that Donald Trump and the Trump administration have been introducing in the last 6 months, and where those are going to go. So it's even more important, I think, to support civil society activists everywhere in the world. My optimism is based on the belief that a younger generation is going to carry this forward. I meet so many determined young people. I ask all of you to find organizations you can support that support civil society activists who are campaigning for democracy, for human rights, for anti-corruption. That's where I think the battles lie in the future. We're seeing tremendous progress in some countries and tremendous steps backwards in many more countries. So thank you so much, Andy, and your colleagues for having me today. As for crypto, well, we'll leave that to another discussion. I beg to differ to some degree with Mark. Sure, they may have benefits, but I'm very, very worried about what the Trump administration is doing to get rid of regulation. I believe that all financial systems need good, sound regulation driven by integrity. I doubt if Mark disagrees with that, and I'm very worried about the deregulation that is taking place at this time. But thank you all. Thank you, Andy. This has been great fun, and I really appreciate the patience of all of you to listen to me for so long. So thank you very much indeed.
Frank, it's been great. I put a note in the chat when Mark was speaking, and I do mean this genuinely. It's always interesting when we have such different points of views on a particular matter and can share them in a constructive and sometimes challenging way. That's the way that we find improvements in our own thinking, by actively listening to the work and thoughts of others. I'm going to close the session just before I finally thank Frank by making reference to this. Some of you have seen me share this a few times. Robert F. Kennedy, this Robert F. Kennedy quote, I think, is actually, it inspires the life out of me. Folks, if I'm ever in a coma, just read this out to me 10 times and I'll come out of it, okay? Every time we turn our heads, this is obviously, this is Robert F. Kennedy. Every time we turn our heads the other way, when we see the law flouted, when we tolerate what we know to be wrong, when we close our eyes and ears to the corrupt because we are too busy or too frightened, when we fail to speak up and speak out, we strike a blow against freedom and decency and justice. And those words, ladies and gentlemen, as you know, were spoken in the 60s. Here we are all these decades later. It's as if they were written for 2025, isn't it? Isn't it, Frank? It isn't it? Ladies and gentlemen, thank you so much for your attendance, participation. Let's just show Frank how much we appreciate his work, his efforts. We're going to continue to work and support all the wonderful effort of Frank and others like him. Let's win this war against corruption because it is there to be won. We, the people, have the power. Let's not forget it. Thank you all very much. Good night. Good afternoon. Thank you. Bye-bye.